a production of the New Jersey Courts.
This begins an oral history interview with retired Associate Justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court, Virginia Long, on December 3rd, 2018, in Lawrenceville, New Jersey, with Sean Illingworth. And thank you very much, Justice Long, for sitting with us.
I'm happy to be here.
All right. To begin, could you tell me where and when you were born?
I was born in Elizabeth, New Jersey on March 1st, 1942.
And for the record, what were your parents' names?
My mother was Eleanor Triana Long, and my father was John Vincent Long.
Now, starting with your mother's side of the family, can you tell me a little bit about the family background, if there was any kind of immigration story there, that sort of thing?
Well, they were first generation Americans. My grandfather, John Triana, was kind of a jack of all trades. That's how he supported his family. My grandmother was the mother of 9 daughters. And so they lived pretty close to the vest in those years. In 1918, my grandfather and 2 of the girls died in the flu epidemic, leaving my grandmother with 7 girls to support. And she just opened a provisions store in the front of her house, making lunches and other things for people. And that's pretty much how she supported the girls for the rest of her life. She was kind of a force of nature for them. And I think of her as the first really strong woman in my background.
Wow, that's incredible that she was able to do that. Do you happen to recall which part of the city she was in?
She was in Peterstown, which was the Italian neighborhood. On the corner of 2nd Avenue, the store is still there. It's just owned, obviously, by different people.
What about your father's side of the family?
My father's father worked the high iron, which was a very, very lucrative and interesting profession. He traveled all over the world. He worked on the Brooklyn Bridge and lots of other very famous bridges, and basically sent money home to his wife and their 5 children. So she ran that family, and that was the second, matriarch that I had familiarity with. And she ran it with an iron hand, is the only way to describe it. But they were crazy about her. My father and his sisters and brothers, they were just crazy about their mother, because she was, of course, the stable force in the home, because their dad, Frank Long, was on the road all the time.
Do you know how your parents met?
Yes, my parents met at a dance. And my mother's friend, Louise Murphy, who she was friendly with for 80 of her 94 years, said to my mother, "Do not dance with that guy, because he will step all over your feet." But she did, and the rest was history.
Now, your mother was of Italian ancestry?
Yes. Yep.
Your father was more English, I guess?
Irish.
Okay.
His mother, Mary O'Reilly, and his father, Frank Long.
Okay. Was in those days, was it unusual for Italians and Irish to get together in Elizabeth?
It was. But it worked out amazingly. My mother's relationship with her in-laws was as familial as if they were her own sisters. That's the only way I can describe it. So it worked out fine.
And do you know how far in their educations they went?
Yes, they both graduated from high school.
Okay. Now, what year did they get married?
I'm going to say probably maybe 1939. Okay. I'm just not positive.
Mm-hmm. And did they have children before you?
No.
Okay.
Nor after.
All right. Only child. So.
Yes. Yep.
All right. Did they ever talk about the impact of the Great Depression on their lives in particular, or like Elizabeth as a whole?
They talked so much about the Great Depression that I feel like I lived during the Depression, even though I wasn't born yet. It was such a factor in everything that they thought of in terms of saving money, getting a job that would have security. It was, and what could happen to you in a second if the financial world turned upside down. It was an omnipresent thing in my upbringing.
And during World War II, did your father have to go into the service, or?
No, he was, because policemen were they were of the necessary group that was excluded. So.
What did he do on the police force?
He did everything. He started out as a foot patrolman, then he went to the radio car, then he became the head of the records room, and he ultimately retired as the deputy chief of a very large urban police department.
And did your mother ever work outside of the home?
She always worked. She worked, I don't even remember her not working. She worked for the March of Dimes, Democratic headquarters, Edward Whalen's insurance company, and then for many years she was the secretary to the director of finance in Elizabeth.
So did they have a lot of ties with the party? Or was it mostly your mother?
Well, no, my mother mostly, and she was a Democratic committee woman. And they were just interested in politics, though. I mean, politics was discussed. I can remember them being glued to the conventions when they first went on television. And even before that, actually, my mother was a delegate to one of the conventions when she was younger. So.
So probably be watching the 48 convention with Truman, or?
Yeah. No, actually, the one that really sticks in my mind is Adlai Stevenson.
Okay. So what are your earliest memories of Elizabeth?
They're idyllic memories. Now, they may not be idyllic the way you see things on television and in the movies with the lawns and the children running across the lawns. My backyard was concrete, but we thought the world of it. We had, a tiny garden that grew tomatoes and flowers, and I rode my bicycle in the city streets. I took the bus everywhere, and I spent all my free time in the Elizabeth Public Library, which remains in my memory as the most wonderful place that you can possibly imagine.
How close was it to your home?
A couple of blocks.
Okay.
I used to go down there every Saturday and bring home a shopping bag full of books, and I would read them and bring them back, it was like history repeating itself, because my grandmother, my father's mother, would send him every Saturday to the library to bring home a shopping bag full of books for her.
So growing up in this environment, was that, first, what was the name of the neighborhood, but then also was it like a melting pot area, or was it predominantly one group or another?
Well, it wasn't the area so much. I lived in a 4-family house, and the other people in the house were my aunts and uncles and cousins. And my other cousins, as I told you, there were 7 surviving girls in my mother's family. There were 4 survivors in my father's family. All of them and all their children lived within shooting distance of our house. So that was the milieu in which I grew up.
I'm curious, did any of either the Irish traditions or the Italian traditions live on in your family?
Not so much. I can remember some traditions that nobody knew where they came from. We had to eat herring at midnight on New Year's Eve, and I'm not sure of that, why. And they didn't really observe particularly any individual traditions, but we did have constant parties and familial events that everybody attended.
Mm-hmm. And did religion play a role in your life growing up?
Huge, huge. My parents were extremely observant. We observed everything. I was taught by nuns from first grade until I graduated from college. I never was in a school that wasn't taught by nuns. So it was obviously front and center in our lives.
What was the first school you went to?
Immaculate Conception School in Elizabeth. I went from there to Benedictine Academy, which was a girls' school, also in Elizabeth. And from there, well, I went to college, Dunbarton College of Holy Cross, which was a girls' school in Washington, D.C.
Now, with the grammar school, which order was in charge there?
The Sisters of Charity, and it was only 4 classrooms for 8 grades.
Oh, so you had 2 classrooms?
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
Yep. Yeah.
I'm always curious, that kind of setup, people say it can detract from your education. Some people say it can add your education because you learn about what classes ahead of you are doing. What's your take on that?
Well, I loved being in the lower class and doing my work and their work. And it wasn't quite as interesting when you got into the upper class because you'd already heard it already.
And were all these institutions all girls?
No, I had a co-ed grade school.
Okay. So what interested you the most in school? You know, up through maybe high school?
What interested me? Everything but gym. I mean, I was interested in everything, but I was definitely not an athlete.
And do you feel like they were always pushing you towards more and more academic achievement?
The nuns?
Yeah, at school
Yeah,
or
they
others.
were. And let me tell you, they were the first highly educated women that I came in contact with. They had master's degrees and PhDs, and so they were role models for us, and they were always encouraging us to do more and more things.
Tell me a little bit more about what life was like in Elizabeth when you were growing up in the 50s, late 40s, 50s, 60s.
It was a bustling metropolis. That's the only way to describe it. There must have been 6 or 7 movie theaters, all operating very, very successfully. There were fancy department stores, fancy individual stores for clothing. It was just, I can only say, a bustling metropolis. And it was interesting you asked me about religion. There were neighborhoods that were known by the church that they were in. You were in St. Genevieve's Parish, Immaculate Conception, Sacred Heart. And in some of those neighborhoods, there was an ethnic contingency as well. So Sacred Heart and St. Patrick's had the Irish. St. Anthony's had the Italians. St. Hedwig's had Polish. And there was a German contingency at St. Michael's, which is where my mother went to novena every single Wednesday for her whole life.
Okay. So was there real rigid divisions between the groups in town, or?
Well, not really,
Yeah.
not really. But, you kind of knew the people at your church or at your school, and that was just the way it was.
So did you have to work outside of the home at all?
I had a job every single summer and school vacation from the time I was 14 on.
What would you do?
I had some bad jobs, too. I remember the worst. I worked in City Hall, the courthouse, and I had to type old handwritten deeds onto typewritten form. Every day was like 1,000 hours is the only way to describe it, and I was not very good at it, apparently because the boss, a woman, called me in and said, "Virginia, what do you think of this work?" and showed me a page. I said, "Well, I think that looks pretty good." And she said, "I do too. That's Carlene's work. This is your work." And mine had a lot of erasures and holes in it. I was not meant for that life. And I worked in the recreation department. I wrapped gifts in the department stores at Christmas. I always, always had a job. I was a waitress at the shore when I was in college. I just always worked.
Yeah, I was going to ask also if you had opportunities to go outside of Elizabeth before going away to college. Would your family go on vacation?
We
that sort
did.
of thing?
We went on we always went on road trips every year. We always took either a friend or a cousin along, so I would have a companion. And we went to, Canada and Florida and Vermont and New Hampshire.
And you mentioned in our talk on Friday about how Newark was also a center that you would go to.
Yep.
Were there
Newark.
other regional areas you would go to?
Newark was
Yeah.
the place because then all the big department stores, Orbach's, Bamberger's, S. Klein on the Square, Kresge's, Haynes, they were all in Newark. And that is where you shopped for anything that was important. And I think I told you, though, my mother loved to shop, but I would go to the newsreel theaters in Newark, which I don't even know if you know what that is. But
Like
it's a
Pathé,
theater in
yeah.
which only newsreels were shown. My father and I would go and sit in the newsreel theaters and watch news while she filled her bags with whatever, right? And I still don't like to shop.
I'm curious, since she was so active in politics, and you mentioned it was discussed around the dinner
Yeah.
table, so to speak, would she ever take you out campaigning or helping out with
Well, I
things?
wouldn't say campaigning, but I know among the things that she did were to hand out leaflets and put them on, cars under the windshield wipers, and she was in that contingent. And if any of the kids in the house were around, she would drag us along to do our share. I mean, this was not high-level politics. This was grassroots.
So tell me a little bit about the Benedictine Academy. Were they, by that time, were you refining what you were interested in?
Yeah.
Were you looking at more, I guess, liberal arts related things or scientific things or both? Or?
Well, no, it was kind of being refined, but I was interested still in everything, and I kind of did everything. I was in the plays and sang solo in the Glee Club, and I did poetry interpretation. I was the editor of the yearbook, and I mean, I just did everything that you can possibly imagine.
Was that something internal or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Your parents
No.
weren't pushing
Nope.
you to
Nope.
get involved in it?
No, well, they did say you don't just go through a school. You leave an imprint on wherever you go. So,
And was that also Sisters of Charity?
no, they were the Benedictines.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Everyone has stories about the discipline of the nuns. Any?
No, I
Spring
mean
to mind.
they were wonderful. I just loved those nuns. They were fabulous. The Sisters of Charity were tough customers, but they had boys in the classroom, and so that was grade school. And so I guess they felt like they had to be tougher. But they produced the Immaculate Conception produced some amazing people who did amazing things. In my class, there's a professor at MIT, professor at Kane College, so they did a very good job, and the Benedictines as well. And sometimes those nuns were going for their master's degrees and PhDs at night at Seton Hall University, and they would come in the next day and teach us what they learned. Wow. It was really an exciting experience. But I was definitely not interested in science. Mm-hmm. I was interested in liberal arts.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the things we look at is what expectations were raised for women in this era. You would have been there in the late 50s, graduated in 59?
59,
yeah.
Right.
At that point, did you feel like there were certain jobs you could only go into, maybe nursing or teaching or something like that?
Teaching, social work maybe. Something that they called retail, which I guess was, working in a department store. And I can remember being a little girl and my mother saying, teaching is a very good thing because if your husband dies, you can fall back on it. Mm. I mean, I'm planning for my husband's death when I'm 8 years of age, but everybody I knew had the same experience. You were being, funneled into a couple of occupations.
Mm. So, was it always kind of expected that you would go to college?
Yeah.
Okay.
There was never a question about it. And at my school, at Benedictine Academy, everyone went to college.
What other did you only consider Dunbarton or at
No,
Holy Cross?
I actually, Douglas was part of my, was on my list. Barnard was another school that was on my list. But the truth is that I guess I ended up there because everybody else I knew ended up in a Catholic girls' school. Everybody. Whether it was Trinity or Rosemont or Chestnut Hill or whatever. That's where everybody I knew went.
So tell me about going down to Washington. I'm guessing this is one of the times you were really on your own for the first time. What was that experience like?
Well, I mean, it was less on your own than you might imagine. We had mandatory lights out at 9:30 at night, and they flipped the switches even, so you couldn't keep them on if you didn't, you had to be home from, if you went out on a weekend, you'd have to be home at like 10:30, 11 o'clock. People were checking the length of your skirt because we were going into the mini skirt era, and they were checking that. It was a pretty restricted atmosphere. So I wasn't really on my own at all.
Okay. And did they have you mentioned the skirt length, did they have a dress code or?
No, just the
yeah.
skirt length was one of the things that I do recall.
What kind of activities did you get involved in there?
Again, everything that you could possibly imagine. I was in every play. I sang in as a solo in the Glee Club. I wrote for the newspaper. Basically, everything.
Now, you were there when JFK's campaign got started, when he was elected. That must have been particularly exciting at a Catholic school, Irish Catholic background. What do you remember about those days?
Well, it wasn't just Irish Catholic. It was just that he seemed so different from everybody, from regular politicians. He seemed, well, he was sort of like a movie star, an idol more than anything. I went to the inauguration and went and stood out there. It was a freezing cold day, and we watched them go by. And I went to one of the inaugural balls on that night because it wasn't anything too exciting. Boys from the military academies came to Washington, D.C., and the girls from Dunbarton and Trinity and Georgetown Visitation were their dates for the inaugural balls.
So, how far away were you from Kennedy?
Pretty far.
Yeah, okay.
Like about as far as you could humanly possibly be, right?
So did you get interested in national politics at this point?
No, not really. I mean, just as a kind of observer.
Mm-hmm. And what was your major?
English.
Okay. Why did you gravitate towards English?
Well, I think it was part and parcel of all that reading. That is what I like to do. That is what I liked to do then when I was 5 years old. It's what I liked to do when I was 17. It's what I like to do now. And English just was a perfect fit for that. Reading every poem, every play, every, novel assigned. I just loved it.
And do any of your professors stand out in your memory?
Actually, all of them. I have to tell you, I didn't have a bad teacher in college. It was a really wonderful education. It was kind of it was an intense education. It was not one of these things where everybody takes survey courses and moves on. We spent, for example, you had to choose an author, and you would spend the entire year simply writing, explicating poetry, whatever, of that author. It was just a very deep dive into everything that we did.
Was that like a thesis program, or
No,
or
they
just
were
looking at?
Just, if I say that would be the English major's specific program in junior and senior year.
So what were you thinking you would do at the end of college?
I was thinking, well, I thought a lot of things. I took some teaching courses, didn't like it. Took some sociology courses, didn't really like it. And so I really thought I would either be, get a PhD in English or be a doctor or a lawyer. Those were the three things that I kind of drilled down on.
And you entered law school right after,
Right.
So you must have made your decision pretty quickly.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
I just did really well in the LSATs. That was the beginning of the testing program. And I did well enough to get in everywhere, and it struck me that I may have hit pay dirt in terms of where I should be. Plus, I wasn't really that interested in science, so the doctor thing was pretty much pie in the sky.
Before we leave college, did you get involved in any what you might call community activities, things maybe off the campus?
Not off campus, but we did, every school that I attended had a very intense social justice element to it, and that would be college and high school. We were always, doing charitable functions, part and parcel of that. It was part and parcel of the education.
And you said earlier in the summers you would waitress?
Yeah.
Did you have any other jobs in college?
Not at school, no. But I was really busy always. I was on the governing body of the school for all 4 years. Was called the House Committee, and I just kept busy.
What kind of issues would the House Committee deal with?
Misbehavior by people, staying out too late, whatever. Academic issues. Yeah.
Did they, again, they seem to have kept a pretty tight lid on folks.
Yes.